The clink of silver on porcelain was the only music Alara allowed herself to hear. It was a symphony of survival, each delicate sound a note in the score that paid her rent. Here, at Aria, a restaurant so exclusive its name was whispered rather than spoken, survival was an art form. The air tasted of money and saffron, a heady perfume that clung to the velvet drapes and settled on the shoulders of men in $1,000 suits. For Ilara Vance, it was the smell of a world she served but could never inhabit. Her life was a universe away from the hushed elegance of Aria. It was a cramped two-bedroom apartment where the scent of turpentine from her forgotten canvases mingled with the instant ramen she cooked for her 14-year-old brother, Leo. At 22, she was the head of a household of two, the reluctant captain of a ship perpetually taking on water. Each night, she traded her paint-stained fingers for the starched white apron of a server. Her dreams of the Art Institute of Chicago shelved like old books collecting dust. Presiding over this gilded cage was Julian Croft, the general manager. Julian was a man sculpted from condescension and ambition. He moved through the dining room not like a manager, but like a curator of a priceless exhibit, and he viewed his staff as little more than sentient furniture. His smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes, which missed nothing: a fingerprint on a wine glass, a crumb on the floor, a flicker of humanity where sterile perfection was required. He saw a server's genuine warmth not as an asset, but as a vulgar breach of professional distance. Ilara was, by necessity, his best waitress. She was a phantom of efficiency, her movements fluid and economical. She had mastered the Aria smile, a polite, impersonal curve of the lips that betrayed none of the bone-deep weariness or the gnawing anxiety over Leo's upcoming school field trip fee. She could anticipate a patron's need for water before their glass was half empty, describe the notes of a Bordeaux she could never afford to taste, and navigate the treacherous geography of egos at a table of CEOs. She was a vital cog in Julian's flawless machine, and for that he almost tolerated her. For the past 3 months, an anomaly had entered their curated world. An old man. He would appear twice a week, always on a Tuesday and a Thursday, just as the evening's first seating was winding down. He was a whisper of a man, engulfed in a tweed overcoat that had seen better decades. The coat, a handsome herringbone, was meticulously cared for, but the elbows were worn to a soft sheen, and a single button hung by a thread. He would sit at the smallest, most secluded table in the back, a table usually reserved for overflow. He would order only a pot of Earl Grey tea and a single piece of toast. No butter. He never read a book or looked at his phone. He would just sit, nursing his tea for 2 hours, his gaze fixed on a large oil painting that dominated the far wall, a dramatic seascape of a storm-tossed ship. He was quiet, unassuming, and caused no trouble. To Julian, however, he was an affront, a non-patron, a low-ticket table sitter, a stain on the restaurant's pristine image. "See that he is dealt with swiftly, Vance," Julian had hissed at her one evening. "We are not a senior center. The check should be on his table the moment the toast is served." But Ilara saw something else. She was an artist, after all. She saw the story in the lines etched around his pale, intelligent eyes. She saw the faint tremor in the hand that lifted the teacup, a tremor he tried to hide by bracing his wrist against the table. She noticed how his gaze on the painting wasn't one of idle appreciation, but of deep, almost painful contemplation. He reminded her of her grandfather in his last years, a brilliant history professor whittled down by illness, his world shrinking until it was just the view from his window. Ilara had cared for her grandfather, had learned the subtle language of the elderly and the infirm. She knew the tremor in the old man's hand wasn't just age. It looked like the precursor to a blood sugar dip. She saw the slight pallor that sometimes crept over his skin after an hour. These were details Julian would never see, details filed under irrelevant in his world of profit margins and Michelin star aspirations. So she began a campaign of quiet defiance. She would deliver his toast on a warmed plate. She'd bring an extra slice of lemon for his tea without him asking. When clearing his table, she'd murmur, "Is the temperature in here comfortable for you, sir?" He rarely spoke, offering only a gruff nod or a faint surprised glance, but his eyes, for a fleeting moment, would lose their distant, melancholic fog and focus on her with a startling clarity. It was a silent conversation, a fragile thread of connection in the transactional air of Arya. Julian noticed. Of course he noticed. Vance, he said one night, cornering her by the service station, his voice a venomous whisper. Your sentimentality is becoming a liability. That man is a piece of scenery, and a dreary one at that. Your job is to turn tables, not run a hospice. The next time you feel the urge to play nursemaid, remember who signs your paycheck. Yes, Mr. Croft, she'd said, her jaw tight. But she didn't stop. Those small acts of kindness were the only authentic part of her shift. They were a rebellion of one, a tiny assertion that the people she served were more than just a check average. In a life where she felt increasingly powerless, this was the one thing she could control. She wouldn't let Julian's sterile cruelty extinguish the last spark of the person she wanted to be. The first Tuesday in November rolled in on a tide of freezing rain and biting wind. The city was a mess of snarled traffic and angry horns. Inside area, the atmosphere was even more tense than usual. A powerful food critic had been spotted at table 7, and Julian was a coiled serpent of anxiety, his hisses and corrections more pointed than ever. Ilara moved through the chaos with practiced calm, her mind already calculating the tips she'd need to finally fix the leak in their apartment's ceiling. It was nearly 9 o'clock when the old man came in. He looked different tonight. The rain had plastered his silver hair to his scalp, and his handsome tweed coat was soaked through, darkening the wool to the color of slate. He was shivering, not with the gentle tremor she was used to, but with a deep, racking shudder that shook his entire frame. His face was ashen, his lips tinged with a faint blue. He shuffled to his usual table and sank into the chair, looking disoriented and utterly exhausted. Ilara watched him from across the room, a knot of genuine alarm tightening in her chest. This wasn't just a chill. This was the look her grandfather had worn the day he collapsed. He looked dangerously unwell. She saw him fumble with the napkin, his fingers clumsy. He leaned his head back, closing his eyes, his breathing shallow. Julian was hovering over the critics' table, a grotesque symphony of obsequious smiles and flowery descriptions. The other servers were swamped. No one was paying the old man any mind. Ilara felt that familiar, insistent pull, the same instinct that made her check on Leo in the middle of the night or add extra blankets to her grandfather's bed. Policy, Julian's wrath, the critic at table 7, it all evaporated, leaving only a stark, undeniable human need. She slipped into the kitchen. The chefs were in a frenzy, the air thick with steam and shouting. On the warming shelf sat a small pot of chicken, consommé, a clear golden broth used as a base for a more complex soup. It was simple, warm, and nourishing. Her hands moved with a will of their own. She ladled the steaming broth into a simple ceramic mug, not the fine china used for service. She added a pinch of salt. On her way out, she grabbed a small plain bread roll from the basket. It was a peasant's meal in a palace of gastronomy. It was exactly what he needed. She approached his table quietly. "Sir," she whispered. His eyes fluttered open. They were glassy and unfocused. It took them a moment to find her. She held out the warm mug. "I thought you might need this," she said, her voice low and steady. "It's just some broth. Please, it will warm you up." He stared at the mug as if he didn't understand. Then his gaze shifted to her face. The confusion in his eyes slowly receded, replaced by a wave of something raw and vulnerable. It was a look of profound, heart-shattering gratitude. His trembling hands reached out, and she guided them to wrap around the warm ceramic. The simple heat seemed to anchor him. He lifted the mug to his lips with a shaky, deliberate motion and took a slow sip. A flicker of life returned to his eyes. A hint of color seeped back into his cheeks. He took another, deeper sip. He looked at her, his lips parting as if to speak, but only a choked sound emerged. He simply nodded, a single tear carving a path through the weathered landscape of his cheek. The gesture was more eloquent than any word. A warmth bloomed in Ilara's chest, real and true, a stark contrast to the performative warmth she offered patrons all night. She gave him a small, reassuring smile and turned to walk away. "What in the name of all that is holy do you think you are doing, Vance?" The voice was a stiletto of ice plunged between her shoulder blades. Julian Croft stood 10 feet away, his face a mask of apoplectic rage. He had seen it all. The critic had just left, and Julian's attention had snapped back to his kingdom. Mr. Croft, he wasn't well, Ilara began, her voice faltering. He wasn't well? Julian sneered, striding towards her, his voice a low, controlled fury that was somehow more terrifying than a shout. The few remaining patrons at nearby tables fell silent, their forks hovering midair. Are you a doctor now, Vance? Or did you just decide to open a soup kitchen in my dining room? It was just some broth. It wasn't on the menu. It wasn't for a customer. He is not a customer. He is a freeloader who pollutes the ambiance of this establishment, and you just served him an unticketed, unauthorized item. You stole it. You stole from this restaurant to feed a vagrant. He gestured dismissively at the old man, who was now watching the scene with wide, alarmed eyes, clutching the mug like a lifeline. I didn't steal anything, Ilara said, her own anger a surprising spark against her fear. He was shivering. He looked like he was about to pass out. It was the decent thing to do. Decency? Julian let out a short, incredulous laugh. Decency is a luxury we don't afford here. We deal in excellence, in perfection. And you have just contaminated my dining room with your pathetic, misguided pity. His face was inches from hers, his breath smelling of stale espresso and contempt. I have warned you. I have told you to cease your interactions with this artifact. You have willfully and flagrantly disobeyed a direct order. Over a cup of soup that was going to be thrown out, she shot back, her voice trembling with a rage she hadn't felt in years. It was the rage of every sacrifice she'd ever made, every dream she'd deferred. Julian's eyes narrowed into venomous slits. He seemed to savor the moment, the absolute crushing power he held over her. He straightened up, and his voice became loud, theatrical, and utterly damning. Ilara Vance, he announced, his voice ringing through the now silent restaurant. As the general manager of Aria, I am terminating your employment, effective immediately. Your final act of service will be to escort yourself out of my restaurant. You are fired for theft and gross insubordination. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. Fired. The sounds of the room, the distant clatter from the kitchen, the soft music, all faded into a dull roar in her ears. The stares of the other patrons felt like hot needles on her skin. She saw the shock on the faces of her fellow servers. In the corner, the old man looked utterly devastated, his face a canvas of horror and self-recrimination. Humiliation, hot and suffocating, washed over her. Leo, the rent, the leaky ceiling, the field trip. Her mind fractured into 1,000 panicked thoughts. You can't be serious, she whispered, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a cold, hollowing dread. I have never been more serious in my life, Julian said, a cruel, triumphant smirk playing on his lips. Your locker will be cleared out and the contents mailed to you. Now get out. He turned his back on her, a curt, final dismissal. He was already signaling for another server to clear the old man's table. Numbly, Ilara untied the strings of her apron. Her hands fumbled with the knot. She let it fall to the floor. Without looking at anyone, her head held high in a last, desperate act of pride, she walked toward the grand entrance. But as she passed the old man's table, her eyes met his. He was on his feet, his hand outstretched, his mouth open as if to protest, to intervene. Ilara gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. It wasn't his fault. It was hers, for believing a single act of kindness could survive in a place like this. She pushed through the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the freezing night. The icy rain was a brutal slap, but she welcomed it. It was a clean pain, an honest misery, unlike the gilded poison of the world she had just left behind. The bell above the door chimed softly, a mournful final note. The rain was relentless, a cold, stinging penance. It soaked through her thin blouse in seconds, plastering her hair to her face and neck. A taxi hissed by, spraying a curtain of grimy water that soaked her slacks to the knee. Inside Araya, just moments ago, she'd had a job, a purpose, a fragile grip on solvency. Now she was just another girl shivering on a street corner, jobless and invisible. The long walk home was a blur of smeared city lights and the rhythmic squelch of her soaked shoes. Julian's words played on a cruel, repeating loop in her mind. Terminating your employment, theft, get out. He had branded her a thief for a cup of broth. The injustice of it was so profound it felt like a physical weight on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw at the edges of her numbness. The rent was due in 10 days. $1,200. She had maybe $300 in her checking account. The final paycheck Julian had mentioned would be meager, and he would surely take his time sending it. Leo's field trip fee, $75 she had promised him she'd have by Friday, felt like $1 million debt. The refrigerator was a wasteland of condiments and a half-gallon of milk. Every warm, glowing window she passed was a diorama of a life that wasn't hers. Families laughing in diners, couples sharing wine in bistros, people living their ordinary, secure lives. Her own life, so carefully constructed from tips and sheer willpower, had just been demolished by a petty tyrant's whim. Was it really about the broth, or was it about the principle? She had dared to operate on a code of conduct that superseded Julian's. She had chosen human empathy over restaurant policy, compassion over profit. In Julian's meticulously curated world, that was the ultimate sin. She had shown allegiance to a fellow human being, a loyalty Julian demanded be reserved solely for the brand, for the bottom line, for him. By the time she reached her walk-up apartment building, she was shivering so violently her teeth chattered. She trudged up the 3 flights of stairs, leaving a trail of damp footprints on the worn linoleum. She let herself into the apartment as quietly as she could. Leo was at the small kitchen table, hunched over his homework, a pair of oversized headphones clamped over his ears. He didn't hear her come in. For a moment she just watched him, his face scrunched in concentration. He was the reason for all of it. The long hours, the aching feet, the swallowed pride. He was her whole world, and she had just failed him. Elle? Leo's voice startled her. He had pulled off his headphones. You're home early, and you're soaked. Did you walk? His eyes, so much like their mother's, widened with concern. The bus was running late. It's miserable out there, she lied, forcing a smile that felt brittle enough to shatter. She couldn't bring herself to tell him. Not yet. The shame was a physical taste in her mouth, bitter as bile. After a long, hot shower that did little to warm the ice in her soul, she sat at the kitchen table long after Leo had gone to bed. The pile of unpaid bills was her silent accuser. The panic was no longer a clawing thing at the edges. It was a suffocating blanket, heavy and smothering. She opened her laptop, the screen's harsh light illuminating her tired face. Job postings, server, hostess, barista. Each one felt like a step down, a move further away from her dreams. Most required references. Who would she put? Julian would gleefully sabotage any attempt she made to find new work in the city's tight-knit restaurant community. He wouldn't just fire her, he would blackball her. The accusation of theft, however baseless, was a poison that would contaminate everything it touched. Hours bled into one another. The rain finally tapered off, leaving the city draped in an eerie, dripping silence. She felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. She had always been the strong one, the survivor, the one who figured things out. But for the first time since her parents' accident years ago, she felt the crushing weight of true hopelessness. The world felt rigged, a game designed for people like Julian to win and people like her to lose. Her thoughts drifted to the old man. She hoped he was warm and safe. She hoped the broth had helped. And then an ugly, resentful thought surfaced. Her life was in ruins because of him. He would wake up tomorrow and go about his day, while her world had completely imploded. She knew it wasn't his fault, logically. But in the dark, lonely silence of 3 a.m., anger was an easier emotion to bear than terror. She finally closed the laptop, having sent out a few desperate, flimsy applications. She peeked into Leo's room. He was fast asleep, one arm thrown over his head. His peaceful, untroubled face was the only thing keeping her from shattering completely. "I'll fix this, kiddo," she whispered into the darkness. "I promise." But as she crawled into her own bed, the promise felt like a lie. A desperate prayer offered up to a silent, indifferent sky. She lay awake for hours, staring at the water stain on the ceiling, each slow drip from the eaves outside a tick of a clock counting down to a future she couldn't bear to face. The next morning arrived with a pale, watery sunlight that did nothing to dispel the gloom clinging to Alara's spirit. The frantic, sleepless night had only sharpened her anxiety. She made breakfast for Leo, a performance of normalcy that felt hollow and exhausting. The forced cheerfulness in her voice sounded alien to her own ears. After he left for school, the apartment's silence became a roaring accusation. She returned to the laptop, to the dispiriting cycle of online applications and tailored cover letters. Each click of the submit button felt like dropping a pebble into a bottomless well. She settled on a vague, sanitized reason for leaving Arya, seeking a new environment for professional growth. It felt like a pathetic euphemism for the truth. Around 11 o'clock, a sound from the street below broke her concentration. It was a deep, guttural purr, the sound of an engine so refined and powerful it seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. It was utterly alien to the usual chorus of sputtering delivery trucks and rattling sedans on her block. She peered out the window, and her heart gave a painful lurch. Parked directly in front of her building, taking up 2 spaces, was a car that didn't belong in her zip code, or perhaps even on her planet. It was a long, impossibly black Maybach, polished to a mirror finish that reflected the drab brick of her building in sleek, distorted lines. It wasn't just a car, it was a declaration of wealth so vast it was abstract. Windows of neighboring apartments slid open. People on the sidewalk stopped and stared, their phones emerging to take pictures. Alara's first thought was that it was a film shoot. Her second, a jolt of pure, unadulterated panic, was that it was some kind of ultra-high-end collections agency. Had she defaulted on a student loan she'd forgotten about? The idea was ludicrous, but her mind was already wired for disaster. She watched, frozen, as the rear door opened with a silent, hydraulic hiss. A man emerged. He was in his late 40s, tall with the lean build of a runner. He was dressed in a charcoal suit so perfectly tailored it seemed to have been woven onto his frame. He held a slim, elegant leather briefcase in one hand. His silver-streaked hair was cut with razor-sharp precision, and he moved with an air of unhurried confidence that spoke of boardrooms and global influence. He glanced at the building's address, then his gaze traveled up, seeming to lock directly onto her window. Alara recoiled as if she'd been struck. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A moment later, a knock echoed from her front door. It wasn't a casual rap. It was a sharp, deliberate, 3-beat summons. It was the knock of someone who had never in his life been kept waiting. She stood paralyzed in the center of her small living room. Who was he? What could he possibly want? Maybe if she didn't answer, he would leave. But the knock came again, louder, more insistent. Taking a shallow, shaky breath, she tiptoed to the door and peered through the peephole. The fisheye lens showed the man standing with serene patience, his posture perfect. He wasn't going anywhere. Her hand trembled as she slid the chain lock and turned the deadbolt. She opened the door a few inches, the chain holding it fast. "Can I help you?" Her voice was a reedy whisper. The man's expression was neutral, professional. "Ms. Alara Vance?" he asked. His voice was a smooth, cultured baritone. "Yes? My name is Marcus Thorne. I am an attorney." He held up a business card. The lettering was embossed on thick, creamy stock. "I represent a client who has asked me to speak with you regarding the events of last night. May I have a moment of your time?" An attorney. Alara's blood ran cold. The worst-case scenarios flooded her mind. Arya was suing her. For the broth. For defamation. Was Julian pressing criminal charges for theft? I don't understand. I can't afford a lawyer. I haven't done anything wrong." "You are in no legal jeopardy, Ms. Vance, I assure you," Mr. Thorne said calmly, his eyes betraying a hint of sympathy as he read the terror on her face. "Quite the contrary. My client feels a profound injustice has occurred. He has a proposal for you." A proposal? From whom? The only person involved was the old man. But that was impossible. A man who couldn't afford more than tea and toast didn't retain lawyers who wore suits that cost more than her car and arrived in Maybachs. "I'm sorry, I'm very confused," she stammered. "Understandably so," the lawyer replied with practiced patience. "It would be far simpler to explain if you would consent to accompany me. My client wishes to meet with you in person. He is waiting. Accompany you where? She asked, her suspicion overriding her fear. Back to Aria, he said. The suggestion was so utterly preposterous, so audaciously insane, that Alara almost laughed. Go back to the scene of the most profound humiliation of her life, the place she had been cast out of like garbage? Absolutely not. No, why would I ever go back there? Because, Ms. Vance, Mr. Thorne said, his gaze steady and serious, my client is in a unique position to rectify the situation. In fact, he is the only one who can. I can promise you it will be to your significant advantage. He slid the business card through the crack in the door. It landed on the floor with a soft flutter. My client is a very private individual, but he is also a man of considerable conviction. We will wait in the car for 15 minutes. If you decide to join us, we can address this matter today. If not, I will respect your wishes, but you may be forgoing an opportunity of a lifetime. With that, he gave a slight nod, turned, and walked down the hall. Ilara watched through the peephole as he descended the stairs and was admitted back into the silent waiting car. She stood with her back to the door, her mind a raging tempest of fear, disbelief, and a tiny, treacherous spark of curiosity. Every rational instinct screamed at her to lock the door, close the blinds, and pretend this never happened. It was a trick, a cruel, elaborate prank orchestrated by Julian. But then she looked at the expensive card on her worn floor. She thought of Leo. She thought of the eviction notice that would surely come. What did she have left to lose? Her dignity? Julian had already stripped her of that last night. What if this was real? What if this was the one inexplicable lottery ticket chance to climb out of the hole she was in? With a surge of desperate resolve that felt more like leaping off a cliff than making a choice, she unlatched the chain. She had 15 minutes to change her clothes, and maybe, just maybe, her life. Her fingers were clumsy as she pulled on her only interview-appropriate outfit, a pair of simple black pants and a clean, but slightly worn cream-colored blouse. She stared at her reflection. A pale, frightened girl with shadowed eyes stared back. This was madness. Yet as she walked out of her building and toward the gleaming black car, a strange calm settled over her. The neighbors stared, their mouths agape. Let them! Mr. Thorne emerged and held the rear door open for her. The interior of the Maybach was a different dimension. Plush cream leather, polished burled walnut, the faint, clean scent of wealth. The door closed with a solid, satisfying thud, and the chaotic sounds of her neighborhood vanished, replaced by an absolute cathedral-like silence. The journey was short and conducted in that same unnerving quiet. Mr. Thorne didn't speak, his attention focused on a tablet. Ilara's mind raced. Who was this client? The old man was the only possible link, but the disparity between the man in the tweed coat and this level of opulence was a chasm her imagination could not bridge. As they turned onto the final street, her stomach clenched into a tight, painful knot. There it was, Aria. But the scene outside was different. Another identical black Maybach was parked at the curb. Standing on the sidewalk beside it, in quiet conversation, were two people. One was a sharp, impeccably dressed woman in a navy pantsuit, holding a tablet. The other made Alara's breath catch in her throat. It was the old man. But it wasn't. He was wearing the same herringbone tweed overcoat, but it was unbuttoned, revealing a flawlessly tailored charcoal suit beneath. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed. He stood not with the weary slump of age, but with an erect, commanding posture. The frail vulnerability was gone, replaced by an aura of quiet, formidable power. His pale blue eyes, which she had only ever seen as clouded with sadness or gratitude, were now clear, sharp, and intensely focused as he looked toward their approaching car. The transformation was so profound, so utterly disorienting, that Alara felt a wave of vertigo. Her lawyer, Mr. Thorne, seemed to anticipate her shock. "Allow me to formally introduce my client, Ms. Vance," he said, his voice calm as their car glided to a silent halt. "Mr. Alistair Sterling." The name echoed in her memory. Sterling Ventures, the real estate titan, the legendary investor whose name was etched onto the cornerstones of half the skyscrapers in the city. A man notoriously private, almost a recluse, who hadn't been photographed in a decade. As Mr. Thorne opened her door and she stepped onto the pavement, Ilara felt as though the solid ground beneath her feet had turned to mist. Alistair Sterling ended his conversation and turned to face her. The look in his eyes was complex, a hint of the kind sadness she recognized, mixed with a deep, assessing intelligence and a flicker of wry amusement. "Ms. Vance," he said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone, a voice that commanded boardrooms, utterly unlike the silence she knew. "Thank you for your courage in coming here. I apologize for the theatricality of this arrangement, but I find that certain situations require a departure from subtlety." He gestured to the woman beside him. "This is my chief counsel, Ms. Albright." The woman gave Ilara a curt, professional nod. Ilara couldn't form a word. She could only stare, her mind struggling to fuse the two images, the shivering man clutching a mug of broth and the titan of industry standing before her. I don't understand," she finally managed. Who are you?" A shadow of that familiar melancholy crossed his face. "I am a man who has spent the last year discovering that the assets listed on a balance sheet are a poor measure of a life's worth," he said, his tone cryptic. He then turned his gaze to the grand facade of the restaurant. "Sterling Ventures owns this building, Ms. Vance. We also own the land beneath it and the air rights above it." Ilara's jaw went slack. "And," Alistair Sterling continued, his voice hardening almost imperceptibly, "through a private equity firm that my company acquired 6 months ago, I am, as of last Thursday, the majority owner of the restaurant group that operates Aria." The world tilted. Ilara reached out and braced her hand against the cold metal of the car. He didn't just own the building. He owned Julian's job. He owned the job she had just been so cruelly fired from. "For the past year since my wife passed away," Mr. Sterling said, his voice softening again as he turned back to her, "I have been revisiting. I've been shedding the armor of my life and sitting in the quiet places she loved. A park bench, a library, this restaurant. She adored that painting." He nodded toward the window, the one of the ship in the storm. "She said it reminded her of me." He took a step closer, his eyes locking with hers. "I wanted to see if the world she believed in, a world where decency and compassion still mattered, truly existed. Mostly I found indifference. People see an old coat, not an old man. They see a nuisance, not a soul. They are too busy, too important." He paused, and the intensity in his gaze was unnerving. "Until last night. Last night, you didn't see an asset or a liability. You saw a human being who was cold and in pain. You risked your own security for a simple act of human decency, an act my Eleanor would have applauded." Tears pricked at Ilara's eyes as the sheer, impossible reality of the situation crashed down on her. "And for that act," Alistair Sterling finished, his voice dropping, turning to cold, polished steel as he looked past her, toward the doors of Aria, "you were brutalized. You were punished. That is an outcome I am not prepared to tolerate. Shall we go inside? I believe Mr. Croft is overdue for his performance review." The chime of the bell above Aria's door was the same, but this time it was not a sound of dismissal, but of reckoning. Julian Croft was standing near the host stand, meticulously adjusting a floral arrangement. He looked up, his face registering a sequence of emotions. First confusion at seeing Ilara, then a flash of indignant fury, and finally a state of utter, slack-jawed shock as he took in Alistair Sterling and his entourage of lawyers. "Vance!" he sputtered, his carefully constructed composure cracking. "I told you, you are trespassing. I am calling security." "That will not be necessary, Mr. Croft," said Marcus Thorne, his voice slicing through the restaurant's hushed atmosphere. The few early lunch patrons fell silent, their forks still. Alistair Sterling walked slowly into the center of the room, his gaze sweeping across the dining room, not as a visitor, but as a king surveying his domain. He stopped directly in front of Julian, his calm presence more menacing than any shouted threat. "Mr. Croft," Alistair began, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner. "My name is Alistair Sterling, and you work for me." The blood drained from Julian's face. He looked as if he'd been poleaxed. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. For 3 months I have sat at that table in the corner, Alistair continued, gesturing with a slight nod. And I have observed. I have observed you berate your staff for imagined infractions. I have observed you fawn over patrons you deem important and sneer at those you do not. And I have observed your complete and utter lack of basic human decency. Julian finally found his voice, a strangled, panicked squeak. Sir, Mr. Sterling, sir, I had no idea. I was simply maintaining the standards of the establishment. The policies are very strict. Ah, yes, the policies, Alistair said, a dangerous glint in his eye. A refuge for the insecure and a weapon for the cruel. Tell me, Mr. Croft, is there a policy against offering warmth to a man who is freezing? Is there a rule that dictates compassion is a fireable offense? It was. It was an unauthorized distribution of inventory, Julian stammered, clinging to the wreckage of his corporate jargon. Theft. Inventory, Alistair mused, his voice dangerously soft. Let's talk about inventory, shall we? Ms. Albright? The lead counsel stepped forward, tapping her tablet. At Mr. Sterling's request, my team conducted a full forensic audit of Araya's financials and inventory logs overnight. We found a rather fascinating pattern, Mr. Croft, specifically regarding the wine cellar. Julian began to sweat, a fine sheen appearing on his forehead. It seems, Ms. Albright continued, her tone clinical, that a significant number of bottles of very expensive vintage wine, a 1982 Cheval Blanc, a 2005 Romanée Conti, have been logged as breakage or corked, always under your manager's code. Yet our investigation traced several of these exact vintages to a private online auction site, sold by an anonymous seller whose account is linked to a bank account in your name. The final devastating blow landed. Julian's arrogant facade disintegrated, revealing the terrified, cornered fraud beneath. That's a misunderstanding. A clerical error, he whispered, his eyes darting around as if seeking an escape route where there was none. You have been systematically embezzling from this restaurant for over a year, Alistair stated, his voice flat and final. While terrorizing a young woman over a cup of broth that cost less than $1, you were stealing tens of thousands. The irony is breathtaking. He then looked over at Alara, his gaze softening for a fraction of a second. Ms. Vance, one last question. 2 weeks ago, on a Tuesday, I watched you speak to Mr. Croft about the last bottle of the 96 Latour. What did you tell him? Alara, shocked to be addressed, searched her memory. Her artist's eye for detail, her curse and her gift, brought the image back. I told him to be careful with it. The foil on the capsule was slightly torn. A tiny detail, but it was distinctive. Alistair nodded slowly, then looked back at Julian. A bottle with a torn foil capsule was sold by your anonymous seller 3 days later. The bottle you reported as corked and discarded. It was over. Julian Croft stood exposed, a common thief stripped of his borrowed finery. He looked at Alara, his eyes filled with a desperate, venomous hatred. She was the architect of his ruin, not by malice, but by a simple act of kindness that had unraveled his entire world. Mr. Thorne, Alistair said calmly, please inform the police, who are waiting discreetly outside, that Mr. Croft is ready to cooperate with their investigation into grand larceny. Have security escort him out. Through the kitchen. The final indignity, not the grand front doors, but the greasy, clattering exit of the staff. Silently, 2 large men in suits materialized and flanked Julian. They led the trembling, defeated man away, his reign of petty tyranny ending not with a bang, but with the squeak of kitchen doors. The restaurant was utterly still. Alistair Peterson turned his back on the scene and faced Alara. The steel in his eyes was gone, replaced once more by a weary, profound kindness. Now, Ms. Vance, he said softly, let us discuss your future. The silence that fell in the wake of Julian's ignominious exit was heavy and surreal. The remaining staff stood like statues, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and dawning jubilation. Alistair Sterling's gaze swept over them, and for the first time he offered a small, weary smile. Please, everyone, he said, his voice returning to a conversational tone. Take the rest of the day off with full pay. We will be closed until further notice. A collective, audible sigh of relief went through the room. He then turned back to Alara, who was still standing by the host stand, feeling as though she were a character in someone else's dream. Ms. Vance, Alara, would you join me? He gestured to the best table in the house, a corner booth with a panoramic view of the city skyline. Numbly, she walked to the table and slid onto the plush leather seat. Mr. Thorne and Ms. Albright remained standing at a respectful distance, a silent, powerful honor guard. Alistair sat opposite her, the ruthless corporate raider vanishing completely, replaced by the contemplative old man she had first met. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the cityscape. My wife, Eleanor, she would have loved you, he began, his voice soft with memory. She was the architect of our lives, not me. I built the buildings, but she filled them with light. She believed that kindness was the only true currency, the only investment that paid infinite dividends. When she got sick, all of this, he gestured vaguely at the opulent room, the sprawling city. It all became noise, meaningless. He turned his piercing blue eyes back to her. I came here to feel close to her, but instead I just felt more alone. I saw a world that had forgotten her values, a world of Julians. I confess, Ms. Vance, I had grown cynical. I had begun to believe she was wrong. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. And then I saw you, night after night. You weren't just doing your job, you were seeing people. You noticed the loose thread on a woman's cuff and discreetly told her. You helped a man who was struggling to read the menu in the dim light. And you saw me, not as a nuisance, but as a person who might be cold, who might be unwell. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. You did not offer me charity. You offered me dignity, at a time when I felt I had none left. What you did was not a small thing, Alara. It was everything. Alara finally found her voice, a fragile whisper. I was just doing what anyone should do. Precisely, he said, a sad smile touching his lips. And that is what makes it so rare. Which brings me to your future. Giving you your old job back is not an option. It's an insult. You don't belong here. Her heart plummeted. Not as a server, he clarified quickly, seeing the fear in her eyes. This place as it exists is a reflection of Julian Croft's values. Superficial, cold, exclusive. I want to tear it down to the studs, metaphorically speaking, and rebuild it in Eleanor's image. A place of warmth, of genuine hospitality, of art. A place where the food is excellent, but the humanity is exceptional. He sat back, his expression turning from reflective to resolute. You have the soul of an artist, Ms. Vance. I've known that from the beginning. Your dream is not to serve tables, but to create. I read your file. The Art Institute. Alara's breath hitched. She had written that on her initial application 2 years ago, a foolish, hopeful little note under aspirations. I am not offering you a job, Alistair said. I am offering you a partnership. I want you to be the new creative director for the Sterling Hospitality Group, starting with this flagship location. I want you to oversee the complete redesign, the art, the ambiance, the staff training. I want you to infuse this place with your spirit. I will provide the capital, you will provide the vision. It was too much. The words were too big, the concepts too vast. Creative director, redesign, her, a girl who worried about a $75 field trip fee. Mr. Sterling, I can't, she stammered, overwhelmed. I have no experience, no degree. I'm just a waitress. You are an artist with a profound understanding of human nature. That is a qualification no university can bestow. He countered gently but firmly. The business acumen, the operational details. I will surround you with the best team in the world to handle that. They will work for you. I'm not hiring an MBA, Alara. I'm investing in a visionary. I am investing in character. He saw the conflict, the doubt, the sheer shock warring on her face. Mr. Thorne stepped forward and discreetly placed a sleek, dark blue leather portfolio on the table. Alistair pushed it toward her. This is a more immediate concern, the practicalities. With trembling hands, Alara opened it. The first document was a cashier's check made out to her. The number had so many zeros she couldn't immediately process it. It was a sum that would not just solve her problems, but eradicate them. a sum that represented a lifetime of security. Beneath it were official, notarized documents. At the top of the first page, she read the words, "The Leo Vance Educational and Creative Arts Trust." Her eyes scanned the dense legal text. It was a fully endowed trust managed by Mr. Thorne's firm, established to cover every conceivable expense for her brother's education, private school, tutoring, summer programs, university, even graduate school, and to provide a generous stipend for art supplies, musical instruments, or any creative endeavor he chose to pursue. It was a guarantee of a future free from the suffocating limitations she had fought against her entire life. Seeing Leo's name, so official and permanent, entwined with a promise of such boundless opportunity, was what finally broke her. A sob, raw and cathartic, tore from her throat. It was the sound of years of fear dissolving, of a burden she thought she would carry forever being lifted. I don't know what to say," she wept, looking at the man who had, in 24 hours, shown her the worst and the absolute best of humanity. "Say you'll accept," Alistair said softly. "Say you'll help me build something beautiful in my wife's memory. That is the only payment I require." Through her tears, a radiant, watery smile broke free. She nodded, unable to speak, the single gesture conveying a lifetime of gratitude and hope. "Yes," she finally whispered. "Yes, thank you." Alistair stood, his work complete. "My team will contact you tomorrow to begin the transition. Take some time. Breathe. Go home to your brother." He walked to the far wall and gently touched the frame of the large seascape. "Eleanor was always fond of this artist," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Perhaps your first act as creative director will be to find something a little more hopeful to put in its place." With a final meaningful nod, Alistair Sterling and his lawyers departed, leaving Alara alone in the silent, cavernous restaurant. It was hers now. A kingdom she had won not with power or wealth, but with a simple cup of broth. She remained at the table for a long time, her hand resting protectively on the portfolio that held her brother's future. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Leo. "Hey, where are you? Everything okay?" Ilara smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes and transformed her face. She began to type, her fingers flying across the screen, each word a brick in the foundation of their new life. "Everything is more than okay, kiddo. I'm on my way home, and we're making a stop first. I'm taking you to the art supply store. You can get the professional watercolor set you wanted. Get two." She hit send. As she looked out the window of her restaurant at the city that had once seemed so vast and indifferent, she didn't feel small anymore. She felt like the artist of her own life, standing before a vast, empty, and brilliantly promising canvas. The storm was over. It was time to start painting.